Okay, thank you all for being here. Since I wasn't sure if I should do it in English or German, I decided to just do all the slides in English, and I think now, since all the slides are in English already, I will just give the talk in English if that's fine to everyone. Would be a bit confusing to have English slides and then German speaking. It's also, I think, a good practice for me and for all of us, maybe. So my talk is about the correct role of psychedelics in psychiatry and society, about the current and the possible future role. And I think at the moment it's like somewhere between hype and skepticism, depending on which people you talk to, I guess. So it's of course a talk that's from my subjective view. It's not meant to be scientifically objective. It's a lot of things in my talk are just my personal worldview. So yeah, I'm very happy that so many came. And yeah, I think that's all that needs to be said at the beginning. This is maybe you. That's my mouse. Okay, that's part of the screenshot. I didn't see it. Okay, no, it's not. Well, so this is, I was traveling in Jamaica when I was 19 years old, and I already knew that I wanted to study psychology, and I was traveling through Jamaica, and what was interesting for me to see in Jamaica is the position of cannabis in their culture, because, well, I was only there for 10 days, but I always felt like they didn't just use it as a tool to numb down from problems, or to run away or to just get high, but they, at least in the Rastafarian culture, I felt like they use it as a tool to gain some insights. So it's actually not legal to smoke cannabis in Jamaica, but decriminalized. You may know that concept of other countries as well. So I was traveling also with a group of musicians and artists. That picture or that drawing is from this digital artist. You can see his IG there. And also, I think you can divide substances or drugs into countercultural or culturally accepted drugs. So cannabis is clearly, I think, has been more on the counterculture drugs. Psychedelics, I'd say, often as well, but we will talk about psychedelics later. And I think here again you can see, so the Jacob Miller, the artist, that's the song I just played right before the talk started. So he's addressing the minister, a word with you. He says, you don't fight against the rum head, you don't fight against the wine, the cigarette smoking, yet you know these things give cancer. And so basically saying, like, why is weed or cannabis illegal when actually it is very obvious that there are much worse drugs that are legal. But Rastaman knows the truth, so you can't fool the youth. I think countercultural drugs or substances are often something that's more in the youth as well. And I think I marked that in red because I think it also highlights this that maybe cannabis as well, just like psychedelics, is something that you can use to gain insights in yourself. And of course also songs like this give a sense of empowerment to people who are oppressed for doing those substances instead of those substances. For example, like with weed, where what was hidden from the wise and prudent shall reveal to the babe and suckling. So yeah. So why am I talking about cannabis when actually this talk is supposed to be about psychedelics? Is cannabis a psychedelic? I think that's a I don't know why this is always there. Can't really tell, but it shouldn't bother us too much. So is cannabis a psychedelic? If you asked this guy, Daniel McCrean, yes, he's the head of the Center for Medicinal Mindfulness in Colorado. So basically, they use cannabis just like any other psychedelic in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So he wrote a whole book about it, calling cannabis psychedelic cannabis. Of course, admitting to the fact that cannabis can be abused, but the way they use it, he says it has almost similar effects to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Also note that I don't want to euphemize cannabis in any way, since chronic cannabis use relates to the development of depression, anxiety, and psychosis. There are a lot of studies on that, especially young users are prone to that. So in the age of like 14 to 24, might be especially harmful to use cannabis too much. So this is mostly about chronic cannabis use. By the way, if anyone has any questions, feel free to just ask. So looking at Western society, there's something we call the global mental health crisis going on at the moment. So a lot of people struggle from mental disorders, addiction, depression, anxiety disorders among the most common. And usual medical treatments don't always work sufficiently. Looking at depression, for example, antidepressants, which are often used, have a lot of side effects. They work well mostly for the anxiety symptoms, actually, so they are also given for cases like OCD or anxiety disorders. But another problem with antidepressants, besides the side effects and that they only work mostly for the anxiety, is that they often don't address the anhedonia. And also there are discontinuation symptoms, so I guess you could call that withdrawal light. So like a light withdrawal after you discontinue the use of antidepressants, which can become sometimes severe depending on the other factors in a person's life. And also anxiolytics, which were meant to address anxiety problems. They, I think, cause, obviously, if you know about this, a lot of problems, especially in the US. So like severe addiction and withdrawal. If you just withdraw from Xanax after having been on it, you can die of that. And while psychotherapy is often effective, I think medicinal help could be better. And especially severe cases are resistant to usual psychotherapy, and I guess you know where this leads. Yeah, psychedelics. So as Humphrey Osmond, who coined the term psychedelic, said, "To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." So psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is used in a clinic. When used in a clinical setting, psychedelics are very safe and proven to be effective for some disorders. I will talk about that later. And also classical psychedelics don't produce physical addiction and are physically very safe. No one has ever died from psychedelic overdose. And there's also no other usually physical harmful things with classical psychedelics, at least. So like LSD, psilocybin, DMT. With MDMA, that might be a bit different. And also, of course, a very great advantage is that you just have usually 1 to 3 sessions per year, so you don't take that medication every day. And also psychedelics may even treat the anhedonia symptoms in depression, which other medicine can't do usually. So, for example, in the trip that Albert Hoffman had, I don't know, maybe you read it or heard about it, his first LSD trip he ever had, when he tried the chemical, he didn't know what it was yet, and he had like a really horrific trip at first. Then it went better, and he realized, okay, there was some substance or something like that. But the next morning, even though he had a really terrible trip at parts, he was like, wow, like all the flowers look beautiful, his breakfast tasted well, and all of that. So that's just one case that shows that psychedelics can sometimes enhance that kind of hedonistic pleasure that is maybe important in depression. And also maybe they work as enhancer of positivity. So maybe you know of Beck's triad, that triad of having a bad worldview about oneself, about having a bad view about oneself, the world, and the future. So maybe psychedelics can also counteract such things and act in a refreshing and positive way. So we're now starting basically the section on hype around psychedelics. So this is a really good book. I work with Gregor. I've been an intern at Gregor Hasler's lab for a while now, and he wrote this book when he started working with psychedelics. I think 4 years ago he started with psychedelics, doing psychedelic therapy. And that book is basically a summary of all the ways that psychedelics might enhance psychotherapy when they are used correctly. So I will mention that book a couple of times, and when referenced Hasler 2022, then I refer to this book. So I just took that, it's German, I'm sorry about that. The rest of my presentation is in English, but I just took that because I thought it was a good overview. Although it's probably not a very good evidence, but more like a good evidence. I'm not sure how to really, what's the correct wording here. But MDMA has proved for PTSD to be effective. Psilocybin, for example, for treatment-resistant depression. Then ketamine has been used a lot in psychiatry for depression, sometimes also used as off-label use for other cases like PTSD. Anxiety disorders and anxiety and depression with terminally ill patients. They had some studies on that, and I think it has been proven that psychedelics help with anxiety and depression before dying. And also addiction, often linked to PTSD. And also there's a potential for other disorders like OCD, for example, eating disorders, but I think the research is just not quite there yet. I think OCD, they are in the medical clinical trial phase 1, for example. And also for neurological problems or more physical problems, cluster headaches, for example, Alzheimer, Parkinson, there might be a potential there as well. And of course, it's very interesting to study psychedelics to see how the brain works with neuroplasticity and also consciousness studies. So added to that list, maybe in a few years, do psychedelics help in recovery after stroke? That's a project that will start the next years now. A friend of mine is doing his PhD there in Lake Luzerne, in this beautiful clinic. So we might know more about that in a few years. So at the moment, we're in the psychedelic renaissance, or that has often been said. So when you look, for example, at the published studies, including the search term psychedelic on PubMed, you can see quite a rise starting from 1944 in studies to this day. But maybe we could also call it a hype. I'm not sure. When you look, for example, in technology, you have what's called the Gartner hype cycle. So you usually have an innovation trigger. We could use, in that case, for example, the finding of LSD. And then you have a peak of inflated expectations. So basically, too much of expectations. You have that followed by a trough of disillusionment, and then a slope of enlightenment, and you arrive at a plateau of productivity. So that's from technology, but we could also use that for psychedelics maybe. Maybe we had a first hype there with the hippies, but then the war on drugs was quite a trough of disillusionment, I guess. And maybe we're in the next hype phase right now, or maybe this cycle just repeats over and over, and at some point we might end up at the right plateau of productivity. And also, where in the Renaissance are we? So Ben Sesser, for example, who gave a talk at the Alps conference last year, published this book, The Psychedelic Renaissance, 2012, so that's already 11 years ago. I think he probably started writing that book a few years before, so 15 years ago, people already thought that we're in the psychedelic renaissance. So it's not like that new. And also there's a lot of things that are not really completely understood about psychedelics or studied. For example, we all know, so I'm staying here in the Harvey Osmond wording with the angelic and the devilish thing. So most of us maybe know that psychedelics work or have their subjective effects through the activation of 5-HT2A receptors, so that's serotonin. But they also, most psychedelics also activate 5-HT2B. And actually 5-HT2B agonists have shown to produce fibrosis, so a thickening of heart tissue, I think. Don't study medicine, so I don't know exactly what it is, but so if administered regularly, so those were like substances that have been used for some, I think, physical illnesses that activate the 5-HT2B receptor, and when they were used daily for a long time, they sometimes showed to produce fibrosis. So we don't know if that it is really problematic yet, because most psychedelics activate that receptor as well. But so this is obviously about microdosing. When you take classical psychedelics 3 times a year, there's no problem with that receptor. But there's, at the moment in the research, this worry that microdosing might be dangerous if you do that, for example, microdose for several years, every 3rd day or something like that, so very regularly. Maybe there's a heart condition already. So yeah, so basically this paper here, which published just a few months ago, says that the risk of microdosing for valvular heart disease is currently unknown, and therefore the safety of microdosing is not fully assessed at the moment. That is, I think, might be troubling, might be not troubling, we don't know yet. And of course, if that is the case with this activation of 5-HT2B being problematic, then of course it's a lot about length and frequency of microdosing. So if you take a pause, for example, or you don't do it that often, it's different than, as I said, doing it several years, for example, every 3 days, which would be the Federman protocol. So this topic has been raised a few years ago, and now I think will be around a bit until it's proven to be incorrect or correct, whatever. So, but also there's very cool research out there now about, for example, the gut. We learn a lot about what psychedelics do in the brain. We don't learn a lot about what psychedelics, or there's not a lot of research on that yet, what psychedelics do in the gut, which is of course very interesting. Maybe some of you have known or know already about the research on gut and brain axis and depression, how that, like the microbiome, how that is linked to depression. Yeah.
What is gut?
Gut is Darm.
Oh.
Yes. So I think that will be very interesting, of course, also asking what kind of diet is. So when you go to the Amazon, for example, and you have an ayahuasca retreat, you usually have some kind of diet before that experience. So maybe we could also think more about that in psychotherapy, like what kind of diet should people be on to have the most positive effects from an experience, and what kind of diet should they have after the experience, and all those kind of questions. But really, when you ask psychiatrists if like psychedelics will revolutionize psychiatry, most of them will answer that it's more like one more tool that can be used next to antidepressants and so on. Yeah, now I'm also coming to a new section. So that was more like what's the current research and stuff. Now I have also, like, if you really I want to push it a bit into as much hype as I was able to go. So those are personal ideas I'm sharing with you now. psychedelics is preparation for birth. Microdosing, I have a lot of ideas on. So psychedelic experience, yeah. So that topic is basically, yeah. So this is not very scientific, obviously. It's supposed to be taken lightly. So could psychedelic experiences prepare maybe women for birth? So I've wrote an essay a year ago about traumatic birth. So that is when a woman experiences her birth, giving birth as a traumatic experience. So a lot of loss of control. She doesn't always know what's going on. A lot of pain is involved. She's not able to make all the decisions. A lot of decisions are taken by the caretakers. So that can be a traumatic experience. And there's a study, for example, showing that intolerance of uncertainty predicted women to have more negative birth appraisals and more post-traumatic stress symptoms. So in other words, women having a hard time letting go are predisposed to traumatic birth. So the idea, for example, here would be psychedelic trips. Oh, also, sorry, I wanted to say that as well. Psychedelic trips and giving birth also have some similarities, at least according to Kate Kincaid. She's a ketamine therapist in the USA, and she has given birth. And she said that that giving birth was like a wild acid trip to her. So maybe trips, obviously, before conception, because we don't know yet if is it safe for the baby to have a pregnant woman tripping. Maybe trips could serve as preparation for birth. So maybe you'd say that's completely crazy idea, but when you think about really a utopian society that we could live in using psychedelics the right way, maybe in 10 years that might be a completely useful research question. So that book Island by Aldous Huxley addresses that utopian version of society on the island Pala. So microdosing. Does microdosing turn you into a superhuman? So first idea here is microdosing in healthy people as a soul coffee. So basically, psychedelics reveals something about the psyche or about the soul. So when you use it as a microdose, I think there's still some effect of that soul-revealing property, which might be interesting, of course, for integration purposes. So basically, you don't have a full trip that is completely overwhelming, but you just have microdoses throughout daily life, where you're able to immediately integrate what you realize on the microdose. So the same way we use coffee in our society, we could just, for example, and that's one discussion we will have later if we have the time for it. What's the legality of this? So for example, in the Netherlands, or there are psilocybin truffles that are legal, and so the question would be how much do we trust the citizens with something like that? And you could also use that to, for example, for healthy people as well, to just that doesn't okay. To temporarily treat anhedonia or enhance performance, or for example, when we're ill as well. There are usually some comorbid depressive symptoms. Maybe you could microdose once, for example, in a week where you're ill, and you're able to see things a bit more clear. Maybe are able to do some stuff that you need to do, even though you're ill. So those are just some ideas I had. Then next idea would be microdosing as a. So should check on the time a bit. So I will take a break in like 20 minutes, I think, for like 5 minutes, and then we will see if we continue. Or since I have a rather long presentation, maybe I have to split it up in 2 parts if it takes too long. So microdosing as a cognitive enhancer to just enhance performance. So when you look at psychiatric research on antidepressants, what's really loved in that kind of research is when antidepressants show some cognitive enhancing mechanism, and that's always like, I don't know, I think that's what psychiatrists love when substances enhance cognition, or yeah. And also there's some research on ADHD, which maybe you've heard of, and microdosing. In some trials, microdosing has even been proven more effective than Ritalin, for example. So, next idea, microdosing as the little opener of the doors of perception. So people who microdose say that they perceive more when they are on a microdose. So really I think that's a bit like I said before. Maybe it could be used to integrate previous trips, for example. But then asking those questions like, does microdosing turn you into a superhuman? Do we even want to be superhuman? That's another philosophical question, which is, I think, even more important to address. So enhancing as a human species, I think that can be seen as a normal evolutionary game of fitness. But also, we could ask, are we competing against other people, animals and plants? Do we need to do that? And Alan Watts, who studied a lot about Buddhist and Hinduistic concepts, for example, would say that the goal is to be a normal human being, no matter how enlightened one is. Okay, so now I'm closing off the hype section and coming to more the critical or skepticism section, and I'm going to talk a lot about spirituality and psychedelics here. I think some psychologists and psychotherapists don't usually like addressing spirituality because it seems sometimes not scientific, and they would rather not have that. But if you work with psychedelics, of course you can't really work your way around spirituality. So psychedelics, for example, you could think about them as tools for enlightenment. So I'm asking the question, how many times does one need to become enlightened? This may seem like a joke at first, but also maybe a very interesting question to think about, especially, so there are different, so I think you can answer that question depending on what kind of person you have in front of you. If that's a patient, that might be different than for a healthy person. So I'm asking here basically, how many times do you have to use psychedelics, or should people use psychedelics? Should they use them once a year? Is that, so basically what I'm saying, it should be probably different for every person. So depending on if a person is maybe into meditation and praying and so on, it would maybe need psychedelics less. If it's a very worldly person who doesn't have any spiritual practice, maybe that person might need psychedelics more, but would also be more prone to a bad trip or a challenging experience that he or she is not able to integrate. And then psychedelics are also viewed, especially in psychiatry or psychology, as medicine for mental disorders. So that's the question I think I've talked about now a bit. How to best use them in clinical practice. That is just something that's being studied, I think, in research. We'll show the answers to that question. But then maybe tools for enlightenment and cure for mental disorder, maybe that's okay, maybe it makes sense that is the same thing, psychedelics. But also maybe enlightenment is not the right word to use here. Psychedelics work, as Hasler puts it beautifully, by acutely enhancing the perception of insights or revelations. Then also a point of view is psychedelics as plant teachers. So that has a bit of a romantic touch to it, I find. So that different plants reveal different aspects of life to the user. So mushroom spirit or mother ayahuasca, maybe cannabis in Jamaica as well. So that's another way to view them. So Alan Watts was a very interesting person, I find. I've listened to a lot of his things lately, and So he was a philosopher in he lived from 1915 to 1973, and he was very hyped by the hippies or people who used psychedelics, although he was not talking about psychedelics that often actually. He was more someone who was a lot into Buddhism, Hinduism, Chinese traditions, Zen, Tao, all of that. And he basically translated a lot of that to the Western world in his talks. And what you find in a lot of his work is something like this. The meaning of life is just to be alive. It is so plain and so obvious and so simple, and yet everybody rushes around in a great panic, as if it were necessary to achieve something beyond themselves. So what you find here is something you called entelechy. So there are basically phenomena that have a means to an end, and phenomena that carry their end in themselves. So he would say, for example, when you dance, you just dance to dance. There's no goal to move into a certain direction in the room or something else. You just do it because it's fun. And basically life is like dancing, he says. So it comes from the Greek telos, goal, and in echein, hold. So to have something, the goal held in itself, I guess. That is coined by Aristotle. You could also maybe think about it as intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. That might be the words you use as a psychologist. And psychedelics have been said to enhance experiencing entelechy. And I think that's something we often forget in a performance-oriented society. When studying, for example, in exams, for example, we just study to pass. And it's not necessarily a pleasurable activity to do. We just have a goal in mind and we need to go for that goal. And that's something that a lot of people might suffer from. So Alan Watts was actually rather critical about psychedelics. He believed them not just to be enlightening, but also to be dangerous. So while other slow forms of enlightenment, like meditation or yoga, might not always produce enlightenment and takes years to master, psychedelics can do so in just a day. So basically, those slow forms are the more safe ones, but they might not work for everyone who doesn't have the time for that. And he was especially critical about synthetic ones, since it is easily manageable to do way too much of a psychedelic like LSD. And of course there are bad side effects and adverse effects like HPPD, hallucinogenic perception persisting disorder, if I got it correctly. For example, that is when flashbacks don't go away for a longer period and become something not pleasurable. That is very rare though. Okay, the next idea was a book I just started reading a few weeks ago by Timothy Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert, The Psychedelic Experience. That's also something Alan Watts talked about, this book, and those guys who wrote the book. So this is basically an interpretation of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which includes different stages of dying. And they reused it as a manual for psychedelic experiences. So basically they viewed, and they also said that this book was not really for the dying or the dead or something like that, that's really a book for the living. And so they reused it as a manual for psychedelic experiences, saying basically that ego dissolution already is like a death rebirth experience. Also in psychedelic experiences there's sometimes a rebirth experience in a more literal sense, that people really feel like they are reborn, they are in the womb or whatever. So it's cool that they don't shy away from the question of what happens at and after death, or should we say between death and rebirth, because as this excerpt from the book is saying, it may be argued that nobody can talk about death with authority who has not died. And since nobody apparently has ever returned from death, how can anybody know what death is or what happens after it? the Tibetan will answer, there is not one person, indeed, not one living being that has not returned from death. In fact, we all have died many deaths before we came into this incarnation, and what we call birth is merely the reverse side of death, like a door which we call entrance from outside and exit from inside. So I think what's interesting here is also the duality, or what I've took away from that as well, is the duality of things in this world, like a coin that has two sides, like a room we call exit and entrance, and so death and birth, and there's no more to it basically. So that's a way we could think about death. And how to scientifically address that, I guess you could take DMT experiences or near-death experiences. They share some things in common. You could use physics. For example, the law of conservation of energy that says that energy is never destroyed, but just transformed to another form. But the rest is left to spirituality, I think. So, back with Tuliri and Metzner and Richard Alpert, they also talk about game and non-game reality. So basically, a game in life, or at least that's my interpretation of what they say. That the games in life can be being good at sports, at work, playing a certain role in a good way, so on. So every time you set a goal in life, you start playing a game. And being too involved in games or taking the games you play too seriously might produce suffering. And psychedelics show the non-game reality. And I think that's something you hear people joking about who take psychedelics, that basically, yeah, we're just living in this matrix, everything is just a game and stuff like that. And that also believing in rebirth, like if we believe that excerpt from before, that rebirth exists, that also opens up to a state of mind in which even survival and longevity, since when you die, then you're reborn, then that can open you up to a state of mind where even survival and longevity from yourself and other people are just forms of game or play for human beings. Or as Gregor Hasler puts it, a true yogi lives in the knowledge of using or depleting his karmic rest. So that's a cool state of mind, I think. But also that's something that, like, how to deal with that state of mind is something that Watts criticizes, of how some people who use psychedelics might deal with that. So he warns about people who take psychedelics, calling everything a game. He addresses something he calls holy man syndrome. So that's, for example, someone who took a psychedelic or has had some enlightening experience, and he goes around and says, like, I am divine, therefore above right and wrong. So many people say that. So it's not very uncommon, I think, for people who take psychedelics to say that they are God, or everyone is God, basically, to have that kind of state of mind, or that we are all the universe expressing itself in different forms. So I am God is something that someone might say, or I am divine, but then that might lead to a really unhealthy conclusion, like, therefore I'm above right and wrong, or I can do anything I please, after all it's only a game. And he has seen that back then, at that time, it seems, in especially imbalanced people, he says. And also he questions, would you have to brag about, so basically, if you go around with that state of mind and telling people, like, why are you suffering so much with your addiction and everything, or whatever your struggle is, like, everything is just a game, why are you suffering, like, that of course just, in his opinion, just shows, like, that he doesn't really believe it himself, the truth he found. So why would you have to brag about knowing the truth if we really know that truth to be true? So it shows an insecurity in the person's belief, actually, if you go around challenging people like that. And he also talks then about the Zen literature, where, and he derives from there that it's all part of making a bridge between deep insight and the everyday life of the world. So, for example, the psychedelic experience and the integration of it. And what translates that basically to, it isn't a good idea to go off into ecstasy and not ground it. So that integration part is, he addresses as very important. And what concludes that there has been a divorce between psychiatry and religion. So psychiatry can also be just seen as a business model. So psychiatrists and clinics also need to make money in some way. So having something like a psychedelic that a lot of people believe to be healing and to be maybe even healing very bad cases or healing somebody really fast, of course that's very attractive to use as a psychiatrist as well, in his practice, for example, or in his clinic. So, and then you see that, of course, with people who do psychedelic therapy here in Switzerland, some of them are pretty overrun because it's rather attractive. And also religious people sometimes, I think he criticizes as well. They are sometimes, I think they had some, like you have sometimes Christian churches in or communities who use psychedelics in the US, which maybe not always have the best handle on it as well. So he thinks that both psychiatry and religion are not able to handle psychedelics properly. So for psychedelics to be handled well in society, there needs to be a medical, religious arrangement with both parts being interested in mystical experiences. And also he finishes saying psychiatrists treating people with psychedelics should always have had psychedelics insights themselves into that non-game reality, as Leary puts it, and carry the certainty of eternity when treating patients. So I think I will now I think we could use a 5 minutes break. Is that cool for everyone? And then I will continue. Okay, so the way I prepared the talk, I think I have more, like maybe 20 more minutes to speak and then a few ideas for a discussion. But also I was told that maybe it would be interesting to also let people comment in between. So just feel free to raise your hands and ask or comment something. Are there is there anything anyone wants to say so far to the part I've made? Yes?
You mentioned something about that utopian discussion with the Island book, and you said like probably this question might be tackled like in 10 years. Like why 10 years? Why don't you think people could ask it now?
I think that the research is basically more being done at the moment on severe cases in mental disorders. So that's basically the focus of research, where there's a lot of suffering that might be taken away. And so I think as research moves forward, we can ask in some years questions that are, let's say, less important, maybe. Yeah. Okay, I think otherwise I will continue. So maybe you've recognized what I talked about now, that holy man syndrome that Alan Watts calls it. You could also call that spiritual ego, I think. So that is something that often happens when somebody starts off a spiritual journey. That often creates a spiritual ego at first. That means you identify with being a spiritual person, with doing that kind of spiritual practice or belonging to that kind of religious community. And that is maybe not always dangerous, but can be dangerous because it might lead to feelings of entitlement or superiority. Like, you are not a spiritual person like me because you drink alcohol and you, do those kind of things, and you don't meditate or pray or anything like that. So that's something dangerous that can happen sometimes at the start of a spiritual journey. And there's not only individual ego, but also a collective ego. So that is the sense of exclusive identification of a group. An objective ego can become rigid and obnoxious like an individual ego. And over a period of time, a collective ego gets reinforced continually, becomes virulent, and spreads feelings of extreme intolerance to other groups. Sometimes the collective ego becomes so powerful that one is willing to go any length to protect and preserve this identity. So that's in an article, just a random article, honestly, that I found in the internet talking about collective ego and more about nationality in that case. Of course, you could think about Nazis or something like that, where they start identifying with something stupid like we are white and Jews are bad and stuff like that. That's obviously, yeah, and that's very dangerous, and it's also a form of collective ego. And I don't want to go from Nazis to psychedelic associations, but also, of course, psychedelic associations, groups, and communities are not completely safe from processes of collective ego. So I think it's good to stay aware of the group dynamics that are there, of the dynamics of your own ego, and so on. And there's, of course, a good sense of identity that you can have, an individual identity or a collective identity that can be empowering. You identify with certain values, with maybe empathy or something like that, and not just something superficial that is more on the outside. So when I prepared the talk, I also stumbled across a really interesting video from a Christian community, an American Christian community channel that made interviews with some of their members. And this guy has an especially interesting story that he shares on that channel. So he was into addiction from a young age. He started using heroin, I think, as a teenager, and he was on a bad path, stuck in addictions for, I think, over 10 years. And he was into a lot of trouble. He was in jails and psychiatric wards and so on. And one day in a jail, he had some moment where he found Jesus. So he had some enlightening moment, and he connected that to Jesus and turned to Christianity, and that really helped him heal from his addictions. But then after a while, so he has been on a better path then, but after a while he started to question if his faith was really real. And psychedelics had been part of his past life. When he did heroin and all of those drugs, he also sometimes did psychedelics. It just seemed, obviously not a therapy or something like that he was able to really get much from it. But then still, he knew about psychedelics, and he wondered about his faith, and he thought it would be a good idea to go on a trip again and basically question his own faith. How does he know that it's real? And also to find maybe lies that people are caught up in if they take psychedelics. So he was like in that kind of state of mind. He basically then did that, and he had a bad trip. At first, at least, he thought he would die. Then the devil came and prosecuted him for having taken psychedelics, basically having eaten off the table of the gods, having used those mushrooms. And his trip was but then after a while Jesus came, so it was a really, really interesting trip report there. After a while Jesus came and saved him from the devil and showed him the heaven, basically. So Jesus took him to all the beautiful parts of heaven and showed him, like, hey, it's okay, even though you did something bad, which was taking psychedelics in that case. I'll show you all that you can see. And then after a while he was like, no, please, this is too much. I don't even want to see heaven. This is more than I can handle. So after that trip, he was kind of like, okay, my Christian faith was real. Psychedelics, obviously after a really bad trip, you will probably not feel like doing psychedelics again. So he found that there was no need for psychedelics for him anymore, and he was confirmed in his Christian faith. But what I really found interesting about that video was him seeing things that I think I saw myself as well, that are there sometimes in communities or people who use psychedelics. So that was astonishing to me, that even though he was a heroin addict for so long, and that he was still able to see some pitfalls and dangers in psychedelic communities. So what he's basically saying is that psychedelics give you just enough truth to keep going down the rabbit hole, and just enough lies to keep you bound. I think what he meant in that, it was basically psychedelics, what it did for him at least, they always shared some kind of truth that made him feel like, okay, this is really cool, I need to keep going, I need to keep doing psychedelics. They shared more truths, but never like really enough. And also some lies apparently to him, that kind of, I'm not sure what he meant by that, but I think what he's talking about is basically dependence. So there's no physical dependence with psychedelics, no physical addiction. It's the opposite. Psychedelics can even, in the correct manner, heal people from addiction. But of course there can be a dependence to a pleasurable state. So basically, are you lost when you don't use psychedelics regularly? Do you feel like you're lost in life without psychedelics? So that's something he questions. And for example, also then after his trip, he went to I think some psychedelic community or some cult, or I don't know where that was, but he asked the guy for his views on his trip and stuff, and he was like, yeah, you should have taken more, then it would have been better. And then he questions, of course, that paradigm of taking more, being more healing, lacks logic, and I think that's something we can surely say that's, I think, yeah. And also, what he found was that the need to consume something that also not everybody has access to see God seems weird. Why would you have to have something that not everyone has to witness God or Jesus, how he calls it? So he then finishes his interview by saying that it's about seeing the divinity in daily life, and that you should encounter Jesus the right way through praying, and that's also what Alan Watts would say with the slow forms of enlightenment, like meditation and other forms, yoga, fasting. So that was his take on it, and I think there was some things to learn from me from that. But then I wondered, is it that way that? Oh yeah.
He was first.
Yeah.
Okay. I wonder if you know this infamous Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
Well, I didn't get into it, so that's why I asked you. Maybe you once did the research on what his beliefs are, because he's a Christian and he talks a lot about DMT and other psychedelics in his lectures.
Yeah, I'm not like, I haven't seen a lot from Jordan Peterson, but I think what he says, or what he said, was that also in a way that psychedelics can be dangerous because they might share more truth than you can handle. But maybe you know more.
Yeah, that's really confusing, but because that's actually what I was gonna say. So I was gonna quote Jordan Peterson on what he said about psychedelics, which was beware of honor and wisdom.
Yeah.
So yeah, especially because we both raised our hands at the same time. But yeah, so that's
yeah.
I think it's the same message as the slow forms of enlightenment, or what he said. This guy said in this video. Yeah, honor and wisdom in the sense of you didn't invest years of practice of meditation or prayer or whatever path you go down, but you just take psychedelics and then you have the wisdom. And what do you do with it if you're not prepared for it in a way?
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Okay, any more comments or opening ups for discussion? So what I wondered after watching that video as well is it that way that, because the way he talked about psychedelic communities and psychedelics was in a rather negative way, is it that way that atheists using psychedelics are looking down upon Christians and Christians are looking down on atheists using psychedelics? And I think what I found, also coming from parents where my dad is a scientific person, he studied physics, so he was very in the science world, and my mom was a Christian priest. So, and what I found is often that when people of different religion or different backgrounds, they might actually talk about the same thing, they just use different words. And I think that's what often happens when he talks about Jesus, for example, and God, and we might, as psychedelic people who use psychedelics, might talk about the cosmic universe and just use different words. And I think it's just important to have a tolerance of different worldviews and different languages and the spiritual backgrounds, and try to understand everyone, each other. Then some reminders about psychedelics. Psychedelics are still not incredibly well researched due to the late start in the 60s and war on drugs. Psychedelics are often glorified. You can find that, for example, when an article, non-scientific article, say psychedelics can heal all mental disorders. It's not where the research is, for example, and yeah, that's just a glorification of psychedelics. There's also something I call good faith in the substance. So, for example, the kind of logic where you say, okay, the substance feels healing, therefore it must be healing, which is also, I think, a questionable logic. Just because something feels good or healing, when you use an opiate, for example, it also feels really good, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily really good. So I think that's not a logic we can use. And also, of course, adolescents, especially male teenagers, for example, they like to play the game of who can handle more drugs. For example, who can smoke more weed, who can drink more alcohol. And that goes on to college or universities as well, where people still play those games. And that is, of course, very dangerous by itself, but also when that jumps over on psychedelics. So currently in my internship, I'm very probably doing my first professional trip sitting soon, so I also had to wonder about my own motives. So maybe some of you also have this wish or dream of becoming a psychedelic therapist or a professional trip sitter, but then I had to ask myself this question for the first time now, because I hold this dream in myself. Why would I want to do that? And you can draw from human motives like love, wealth, power, and fame, which are sometimes said to be human motives in research, but also achievement or relationships or belongingness. But I think especially the power motive might be very dangerous when someone has a very strong motive for power doing psychedelic therapy or trip sitting. Because in therapy, for example, there's a huge power discrepancy between the patient and the therapist. The patient obviously talks about a lot of vulnerable stuff. The therapist asks the questions, so therefore that setting is already set up that the therapist has in a way more power, knows a lot about the patient, and also patients are in a more vulnerable state mentally and often physically. And all that power discrepancy is even heightened in psychedelic sessions because the patient is even in a more vulnerable state due to the psychedelic. So the abuse potential is, of course, then huge. And you can see, for example, maybe you've heard about the incident that happened at MAPS a few years ago, which was came out or was more publicly talked about last year, where there was a kind of sexual abuse with a male and a female therapist and a female patient. So, especially when there's a male therapist, I think, and yeah.
does one become a professional trip sitter?
Well, I just use that word, basically a professional trip sitter, when you for example are part of a research project and you trip sit people there. You have like a mini training, I guess. Depends on if you do it, where you do it. Well, I'm in Fribourg, for example, and we have like a trip sitting seminar where we just sit together like once a month to talk about how to best trip sit. So that's what I would call then a professional trip sitter, maybe. Or I guess a professional would be someone who has already trip sitted a lot of people. And yeah, just not just someone who's like, okay, take LSD and I will watch over you a bit. It's fine. Yeah. Also, of course, if there are like ethnical differences, if it's a female patient, and all of that adds up to the potential for abuse. So that's why intervision and supervision is very important in psychedelic therapy. Yes.
And what's MAPS?
MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Science, I think, that Rick Doblin founded like 30 years ago, maybe, or 40. And they do a lot of research and therapy, so they are a huge organization. They do a lot of great research.
Like worldwide? Or
mainly in the US. Yeah.
Maybe I can add some context. So yeah, it's US based, as Pascal already said. And for example, they organized Psychedelic Science this year in Denver, which is the biggest psychedelic conference that ever existed in human history. And they're also pushing the MDMA PTSD studies, the phase 3 studies, that are the first psychedelic phase 3 studies, and which will, according to MAPS, lead to the legalization of MDMA therapy by mid of next year. So they're like one of the top leaders in psychedelic research and psychedelic therapy. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Yes.
I've only ever heard of supervision. What's intervision?
I think supervision is when you have a supervisor, and intervision is when you basically you're one-on-one with the person who, like for example, the trip sitting seminar I mentioned. I think that's more maybe. Good question.
So
Peer group.
Yes,
Yeah.
like an exchange on eye level, not like someone just looking at you, what you do, and correct you, but it's like.
Okay. So also one slide about PROBe. In PROBe's role in the psychedelic renaissance, obviously we do a lot of educational content about psychedelics and how to use them in therapy. But also I want to share with mostly the intern people from PROBe that there's something in psychology you call mere exposure effect. So the more exposed you to something, the more you will start liking it. So if there's a person, for example, who's just coming into your friend group, and you talk to that person, and the more you talk to that person, you start liking that person. And that's like a psychological rule that exists for people and objects and all sorts of things. Basically, it would be just a waste of energy to hate everything around you. So you just start liking everything around you. So I think we can conclude maybe that the more people talk about psychedelics, so PROBe, ALPS, student organizations, the more people will also be likely to use them if they are available. I mean, we can discuss if that is probable, but I think that might be probable. And of course, negative effects and side effects and all the skepticism part I've shared now exists. So I think, yeah, what we do is really cool, but we also need to take care of the prevention and harm reduction part, which we have in our statutes and in our events. For example, the integration rounds we have, or the talk we had last semester on safer use. So despite all the skepticism and critical parts I had, I still wonder if people took more inward trips, would we still have to fly around polluting the air? people were to heal due to psychedelics, would we have to worry less, fear dying less, feel more connected? And if more people experience psychedelics, would the world be more peaceful, or would psychedelics be yet another resource to fight over? So, thank you for your attention. I have some discussion questions following, and also feel free to just eat or drink something. It was a rather long talk. I'm sorry about that. And also, just a quick idea for a new series I had, maybe psychedelic art and music. They have that in Geneva, like a series where you, I don't know, maybe you have ideas as well. I'm a huge hip-hop head, so I could easily do, for example, a PowerPoint on psychedelics portrayed in American hip-hop, which is, yeah, would be a really cool topic for me to talk about, or it could be also a paper publication. Yeah, and yeah, I think we can start with the discussion, or maybe you already have some ideas you want to share. Yeah.
You were talking about the duality of birth and death at one point, but isn't like Buddhism more about the transcendence of birth and death than the duality of it?
What do you mean exactly by transcendence?
So that both of them are like parts of the same thing, parts of the same coin.
Yeah.
So it's about viewing the coin as one and not viewing the coin from one side or another.
Yeah, you could think about it that way, yeah. Yeah, you could focus more on the differences or on the similarity, and that's people love focusing on differences, I think.
Yeah.
Like, you have that kind of hair, I have that kind of hair. It's like, it makes the world interesting when there are differences, and then people forget that they're all from the same coin.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, so I think I will just just for the discussion part. Great. So I have some questions which are basically in the order that I had the talk. So the first question I would like to discuss or hear your views on it is if cannabis is a psychedelic. So do you have any views on that?
I think cannabis has some psychedelic aspects. Like you can have like some states where you feel that everything is connected and stuff like that if you smoke a lot. So it is somewhat psychedelic in a way, I think.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot. When you have cannabis consists of THC and CBD and other components, and I think it depends a lot probably on how much THC you use and how much CBD there is, and that, in the context, of course. Yeah.
I would say, like, phenomenologically speaking, like not now with molecules.
Yeah.
I see it as a psychedelic because you can't really be sure how the trip will be like in advance, like most of the time, unless you're maybe like very routine user of it. And it also affects every person like differently, whilst there are like uppers, like substances or like medications such as Ritalin, who have most of the time very similar effects, reported effects. And if I talk to cannabis users, some like it not at all, some are addicted to it, some use it quite responsibly, but their experiences just are really broad and not just okay, they're all hungry, I guess. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. But does that why does that mean that it's a psychedelic? Are psychedelics very unpredictable, you feel like?
For me, it is. For me, like how it feels.
Yeah.
There is like it has like on this version also. Okay, you could go even further if you smoke a lot. You start also seeing things like I don't know myself. Like I don't smoke that much of cannabis, but I'd argue it is more of a psychedelic, but it's also like more of a spectrum maybe than like this is not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think agreeing with the spectrum idea, I wouldn't categorize it as a psychedelic, although I would agree that it can have psychedelic effects.
Yeah.
But thinking that for many people, many times it does not have psychedelic effects or not very noticeable psychedelic effects. And for example, also the fact that a lot of people use cannabis daily or very frequently, and not in a microdosing way, which I wouldn't see, which I don't think would be possible, in my opinion, if it was like a full psychedelic. Like, for example, with LSD, I wouldn't see that like a remarkable percentage of the population takes 100 micrograms of LSD every day or something, or more.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I think what you also had before in the slide was the Alan Watts said like meditation can have like similar effects, like the psychedelics only takes much longer, and maybe the cannabis is something in between there. It's not like kicking you off directly to the enlightenment, but with like maybe the right setting, it could go to this point, just not that fast like psychedelics do.
Actually, like coming to the setting part, I think like if we would treat cannabis more like a psychedelic and would think about the setting more like we just wouldn't think about it more, then people would have better trips of cannabis, because people would view cannabis as this very subtle drug that they can use everywhere, but that can also like lead to very bad experiences with the substance.
Yeah, I think cannabis can produce much more than psychedelics, paranoia or psychosis.
May I just add the setting is maybe what I was thinking about, why it feels different so many times. Because I mean, if you think of psychedelics, what makes it a psychedelic experience, for me it's really not about like visuals, it's more about cognitions I have on a trip. And on cannabis I get quite self-reflective, I'd say. I think about myself way more than I do like if I'm drinking alcohol or doing other stuff, and I get some enlightenment through it, but if I go in the woods, for example, I would get a completely different inner life than if I would be on a party with people, right? So I think this variation, and again, like Ritalin feels the same everywhere almost, you know, that I think would make it definitely a psychedelic to me, that you have this setting factor and more different thoughts you can have than other substances.
Also because it does change perception, like it makes everything more intense, music or flute or something, or laughing. So I feel like it's psychedelic in that way.
I don't think that kind of this shows you this like absolute reality. Like you're still in the game. You're actually very involved.
I thought I'm also wondering in how far we are very like I feel like the term psychedelic has so much, there's so much like a strong image that comes across with it regarding the hallucinogenic effects and all the imagery, and very intense, but even psychedelic trips are not necessarily that intense all the time as you see it in the movies or on the papers when there's a design for psychedelics. So I think we have this image, but then at the same time it's not even psychedelics themselves are always like that, you know. So it's just
I agree. I think a lot of people also have that expectation that they have crazy hallucinations and then they take a psychedelic, things start moving a bit, but they're still in the reality. So I think it's also you could also we could maybe use another word than hallucination as well, or hallucinogenic. That's, I think, a misleading word, and it comes from cases of schizophrenia and psychosis, and I think it's a different thing than what you experience on psychedelics, but it's just a detail in wording. Yeah.
I think one way that we could look at this question also is about the shift in attention, because from what I see in psychedelics is that it kind of takes away the filter in a way that it lets you perceive more, just generally.
Yeah.
Whereas cannabis is more about not about perceiving, well maybe perceiving more, but only in a sort of tunnel vision frame. So it's more like the attention is still focused on a specific thing, and maybe everything else you perceive less of, and then whatever you focus on is more intense. Whereas with psychedelics you just perceive more in general. There's somewhere along that line, but I think there's
might
some
be
differentiation.
because of the neurobiological difference. The classical psychedelics work on the thalamus. They open that thalamic gate, so a lot of sensory input comes in that would otherwise be gated by the thalamus. In cannabis, I don't think cannabis has that effect on the thalamus.
Yeah, I think if anything, it makes maybe it makes you focus more on the senses that are already there, and makes it more intense, but not allows more in.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
I think it's interesting, but it also depends really on what perspective you take. And I think phenomenologically, I would agree. I think you can have really intense experiences with cannabis. And I notice for myself, I would tend to group them somewhat according to their propensity for addiction, and tend to group things that, in my perspective, are really not addictive as sort of like true psychedelics. And for which case I also don't think ketamine is really a psychedelic. I think it's just something that's used for political reasons, because you can now build ketamine clinics in the US, and they're sort of hoping that they can use the infrastructure in a couple of years for psilocybin or something like that. So it's not so clear cut, I think, and depend. And wasn't it also in Geneva again the discussion about this classical, so it's MDMA psychedelic, and you argue it both ways really.
Yeah, that's another factor I think you can take in consideration, the addiction potential, which is in cannabis quite high, or higher at least than the psychedelics. Yes.
Maybe like on the more meta level, it has a little bit more similarities. What you said before with the game, that you were more into the game with cannabis and more out of the game with the psychedelics. It's when you're really out of the game, you see the whole picture and everything makes sense, and when you're enough in the game, then you suddenly also realize that the game you play also makes sense in a way, the whole picture makes sense. So, yeah.
It's funny how this game metaphor really puts what you said about paranoia earlier into perspective, because if the game is more serious, it makes sense that you can become more paranoid about it, because it's so serious.
I must say I also had some experiences in psychedelics, like LSD, where I was very involved with the game I was playing. So I don't think that psychedelics inherently take you out of the game. They can under the right circumstances and setting. Like if you take psychedelics at the techno events, you are very involved.
Really, yeah.
I'm wondering in how far we are talking about the metaphor of the game, and I want, like, as at least when I think about it, when we talk about it, I'm wondering in how far it could be paralleled with the strength of your ego, of you still being there, your sense of self. So if you're still more in the game, you still have more the sense of the self. You're still there, kind of in whatever kind of reality you're in. Whereas the more you go out of the game, the more you lose this sense of self and you merge with everything else. And which is also maybe the case why potentially THC can be more prone to paranoia, because in order to be paranoid, you probably still need a strong sense of self. And it can also happen with psychedelics, and maybe it's also the case when you're still quite strong, somehow have a sense of self. And it's just a thought, I don't know, but I thought maybe it could somehow be.
No, it makes sense, yeah.
And the game metaphor is quite nice. I never heard about it before, but it makes total sense. I always had a different one, just like that we build layers which make up our ego essentially, and they help us guide through society most of the time. And if you strip away some of those layers and you have a little dose of maybe cannabis or some psychedelic, you get like stripped away a few layers, and this makes you very uncomfortable because you're still in there in the game, but you have kind of less instruments to work with. You don't know anymore what you were used to and who you really were and what's the situation about. But if you take all these layers away, right, and you have your ego death, it kind of takes away this fear, and then you are completely out of the game. So maybe cannabis is like a soft psychedelic which doesn't really take you out of the game, but doesn't put you more in the game, but takes you not far enough out. If that makes sense.
But it's also interesting when you have ego dissolution on psychedelics. For people who have that for the first time, at least, I think many kind of cling to their ego or their usual way of thinking and all of that. But that's very uncomfortable to have that ripped away, right? Like that's also ego death sounds rather like ego death. I don't want to have that. It sounds not so nice. So I think that's also another interesting thing, that psychedelics that can be very uncomfortable to have that ego dissolution, especially in the wrong setting. And that's what Alan Watts, I guess, would say, that with meditation, if you meditate for years and you have those kind of experiences through another way, there's mostly not that discomfort in the experience that can sometimes come with psychedelics, I think, maybe. Yeah. I don't know what you would think about that. Well, so I think we talked a lot about cannabis now. Let's move on to the next. Yeah, so how do you think will the psychedelic renaissance continue? So what kind of research will come next, basically, and where are we in the Renaissance? What do you think? Will the hype go on for a while? Are we in the hype? Are we not in the hype? What are your thoughts on this?
So what you said earlier about the 10 years for the less important things, I think it will take much longer because there's so many mental disorders. And quite some different substances, and I think it will take quite some time. Also for like administrative reasons. I mean, you can't just do like study with psychedelics easily, right? You need to apply and you need money and all of that. So all of that is a long process in itself, and then to go through all the the 1, 2, 3 phases, so I think it will take much longer than 10 years. But I think it will continue.
You think it will continue, yeah?
Yes, like this, but not in 10 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also the research is more into discovering the mental side, also because of the drugs on war and maybe the fear if society is taking
too soon too many psychedelic drugs, then that will affect the research on mental health disorders. So I think it took much more time that this will be integrated more broadly in society, or that research is also more open to do it in other contexts than mental disorders.
Yeah.
And I also think important part of that, I mean, when you hear psychedelics, you have like these old associations with like the war on drugs, all of these negative things. And I mean, I just told my parents I was at this conference in Geneva, and my dad like was asking me, oh, now he was a bit skeptic, to just put it in short. And I think he is not the only one. I mean, a lot of people in the politics who never really got into that, never really read some papers, what they can do for your mental health, and things like this.
Yeah.
They have these associations, and before they don't have a different view on that, before they don't have this paradigm shift, I think it's also a bit complicated to integrate it in society. This might be important step in that.
So to fight the stigma around psychedelics is very important. Yeah.
To put it forward and establish it in a healthy way in the society and in medical therapies.
Yeah, good point.
I think it will just go on steadily and much more cautiously and carefully than it was in the 60s.
Yeah.
And for example, just this setting here is a good example for this. So it's not like we could have just been a bunch of hippies taking LSD together, but we're sitting here discussing like in a student association about psychedelic research, and that's just like how we do it now the next time, because the first time completely failed.
Yeah.
And I think it will go on like this, in a more steady and slow and careful fashion.
Yeah, that would be really cool. And I agree that I also think that it's going to be like that.
I'm actually wondering if it is going to continue like that. I think that is the phase that we are in at the moment, and that was forged over the past 20 years. But the more people come in, I think the more likely there will be less caution around it. And so really, I think it's very hard to keep it that rigorous, let's say, the bigger the system gets, basically. So. Yeah, so I'm very, very curious actually if it will continue like that, or if it will start to loosen up, which of course I think in a more or less controlled way can be good, because you want to also start to probe into more maybe recreational uses of those substances, and you want to probe also more into I think, because as of now it's like, oh, it's science, and oh no, shamans, that's not our thing. But I mean, there's so much experiences and learnings there that at some point we will, at some point now already, we have to start integrating those different aspects more. And I think in order to make that necessary, it will happen that people will loosen up a bit the rigorous scientific mindset, which is important and which helps all of us to talk to our parents about it, basically. But I think it will loosen up, and it will be good if it happens slowly but surely in a way.
I think I've had like we're approaching the peak of inflated expectations a bit, and I mean, one thing, I was reading the Bund, and there was a link to Sonntagszeitung where there was an article about doing legal psychedelic retreats in the Netherlands, and then there was a box like, wo kann ich Antiquity buchen? And I thought, well, yes, this is really the psychedelic renaissance. If my bourgeois standard newspaper has recommendations how to book a psychedelic retreat. And well, I mean, I think also now the interest is there one difference also I see to the 60s is that, you know, nobody was tripping that was older than 30, and now, I mean, I know people who are 80 who are tripping, and that's an important difference. So it's more widespread and established, and so I think it won't really go away, but I think there will be some backlash when that happens, that when MAPS gets the approval for treating PTSD, because that means thousands of therapists will be working with these substances who, you know, like maybe they had a 18-month training with MAPS, but it's not like, you know, all of these psychedelic pioneers who've been working for ages with these substances and very dedicated. And you will get therapists who are just, you know, like, you know, I've done my gestalt, and then I have some this and that, and then I do psychedelic therapy. And just because of the scale, I think they're bound to be, the results will not be as good, and maybe more things might happen, you know, just like that, or somebody has a heart attack or whatever. And that's one thing I feel that will probably dampen the enthusiasm some. And the other thing I think is it's a bit critical is all the money that's pouring in from big tech guys who are billionaires and who are trying to patent stuff, and I'm just a bit afraid that all of this money will destroy some of it and get, you know, people become greedy and start these psychedelic companies with the motivation to become rich, really. So I think that's our two dangers I see, but I also agree that I think it will steadily continue if nothing really super bad happens, and I don't expect that really. We'll see if it takes 10, 20 years. And I think that point, of course, also is it started in those areas where it was the least political resistance would be. That's like in Zurich they started with doing psychedelics testing just physiology, you know, heartbeat, stuff like that. That's basic science, nobody can disagree. And then you go to the stuff where pharma has no real treatments, like treatment-resistant depression, and the healthy people they are lost in the tube. We have to help ourselves.
Yeah, and catch up to the big industry behind it. And I see like another risk is like with the microdosing. I know father of a friend who do microdosing, and he's a programmer, and what he tells of it, that he has like a little bit more creativity or ideas or solutions. And if this like anytime catches up with like the marketplace, that they know, oh, if our workers do microdose, they are more productive, then it could end up really bad, I guess.
What would be the dangers there, you think?
I think if like the plan would be that you make your workers the most productive, and you it would be accepted to microdose, of course, but in this case you would like push people to do the microdose to get more productive or so, or to support it even in a bigger scale.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
So just a friend, she wrote her bachelor thesis about LSD microdosing and creativity. And actually she found out that LSD microdosing does not enhance creativity. So it's kind of like a myth. Of course there's not a lot of research in general on that, but so it's more a subjective feeling that people have, and you can actually, of course, I mean, that's the objective measurements and all of that, but so yeah, the research is not really showing in that direction.
You know,
yeah, it's like
it happens and everybody takes it.
Yes, but then when in a way you need research ground, you know, to sell something like, oh, LSD microdosing doesn't have creativity, now we're selling it. So if there's no research, you can't do that.
I don't agree that it would necessarily be a bad thing, though. Because, I mean, for example, at the Alps conference, there was one talk linking people who have consumed psychedelics to eat more vegetables, eat more fruits, do more sports, and maybe there's some studies going on, but I don't know enough about that, about less screen time and things like that. And if it would be the case, which we don't know yet, but if that would be the case, that the people who microdose actually live healthier, maybe are happier, or just, even if it's just a little bit, but I mean, then maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Like if maybe they drink less alcohol, they do more sports, and they meditate a bit more.
Yeah, I think research would just really have to assess the risks of microdosing properly before this gets to be a really public thing and you have a microdose like you have a coffee.
Yeah, I think it goes also to the question you raised with should we be superhumans or want to be superhumans, and of course it's great if people eat more vegetables and are more healthy, but at one point we should also ask ourselves how much, or is there a limit, or is it a purpose we wanted to achieve?
Can I add there something? We already have it with coffee, when it was like introduced. Now many workers are like coffee addicts, and also I think that this idea of being more healthy and more this and that through drugs, which psychedelics are they're still drugs, right? It's not a goal we should want to achieve. I think, or it's just my utopian society is where we don't have to take medicine for our mental health. We don't have to take medicine for our productivity, but just if necessary, we will do it, but not just like default mode. Like many people live now with coffee, you know, they wake up, they make the coffee. Yeah. Maybe they would have enough energy for the day. Maybe they would be even less nervous that day. So just taking this microdosing could be a good thing if we would scale it up for the industry. I have many worries about this, because imagine humanity in a few centuries and we have found many new substances and many new nutrients we put in the food, and I don't really know if that's the right path to take. So I'm happy that we are taking things slowly and discussing everything and not having it up, because I also think the backlash would be immense if we would just not think about it. I mean, you could also see the papers. I just want to add this. The amount of papers you showed this graph, where it drastically goes up. Yeah. Very much resemble this curve of the technology. And then you know. So I hope this doesn't occur to us, and we are a bit more skeptical of what we are actually doing with those substances.
What's interesting, by the way, with that graph is that, which was really astonishing to me, is that you don't see much of a decrease in those 40 years or so when it was banned. I mean, there is a peak around 1970, but it doesn't go back to zero or something. It's sort of more or less stays level.
Yeah, I guess it's because it's with the term psychedelic on PubMed, and there's also animal studies that kept going. But the first study with humans again was, I think, 1990 by Rick Strassman, or 91?
Yeah, mid-90s,
yeah. So there was no human studies in between, but the animal studies, of course, because this is just psychedelic, are in there as well.
Okay. One actually, regarding how it's going to continue and the potential backlash, to be honest, I really hope that rather sooner than later, the psychedelic renaissance, or the area as such, will start to receive more hits. Like there really needs to be more wind coming against this whole movement, because as of now I think like for the past 20 years, it was like an ecstatic dance. Everything is working out well, but I think it's rather sooner than later you need to start to actually like stand your ground against all sorts of good and valid arguments in order to actually continue to progress and innovate, because otherwise you're just going to stagnate, and any potential bigger backlash will like throw you over because you're just not prepared. I think as of now we're not really prepared for a big backlash because we didn't face enough like, you know, kind of. So I really hope that there's more.
I'm not sure if I agree, because I feel like this backlash happened during the 60s, so and then like all these walls were built, right? And now we're slowly fighting against these walls. So I really feel there is a lot of resistance. I mean, there's so many countries where you can't even do the research. And I mean, Switzerland is the only country where you can do the therapy legally without like a research setting. So I think there's a lot of things we have to fight like against. And I hope we learned from last time.
Yeah, history repeats itself.
Oh, yeah.
Some people say.
The shamans are coming back.
Okay, so usually we have to leave the room at 9, so it's 8:50 now. I had some more discussion points, but I think it's also a good point to maybe end for today.
One last question. What about the bird?
The Mina bird is from the Aldous Huxley book Island. They go around and squeak, or how would you say, what is kind of voice the bird makes. They shout attention, attention, and other things. So they like go around and remind people to be aware and in the moment, and so they have like a cool function on that island. Yeah, that's the Mina bird.
If I may ask one more thing, does somebody have this book?
I have it. Yeah, I can. Okay, I'm reading it at the moment, but I can place it. It's good to know. If you want to read it, I can place it on the library, on the PROBe library.
Nice, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.